and I know I'm dropping the honest pose now, don't you dare call people who are fighting for their lives and resisting an invasion, don't you dare call them silly. And if you're going to call them silly, you have the decency to go say it to their faces, you jumped up half-wit.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. It's Monday morning. I've got Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin on the show. We're going to discuss so much that's gone on between Trump and Iran. There was a story about Trump and Greenland. Greenland saying thanks but no thanks to Trump, and a little bit more going on in Trumpland today. So just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on the Trump Report YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Scott, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Yeah, welcome to a new week of craziness.
Scott, let's kick off with this, what's happened in the last few days. So former CIA officer John Kiriakou, he was on Julian Dory's YouTube show on Friday. He said that conversations he's had with his friend, who's also a fellow CIA officer, they were at the White House. He was talking to his friends, and he said that a decision has been made by the White House to attack Iran on Monday or Tuesday this week, so today or tomorrow, and basically saying that this 10-day deadline for Iran that Trump said was in place will likely be broken, and that those opposing the war in Trump's cabinet is J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard. So, I mean, what do you think about this? So striking today or tomorrow on the 4-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be ominous.
Yeah, first of all, Maddie, on that specific report, I mean, John Kiriakou, who, very fervent critic, indeed was a whistleblower over the Bush administration's march to invade Iraq in 2003. But in part because of that, he and some former other CIA officers are very, very stridently anti-U.S. on whatever issue it is, whatever administration it is. So, in other words, he's positioned in a way that he's going to be very critical of American action on Iran. Fair enough. But it also means that it tends to shade their predictions. And it's like, oh, they're definitely going to attack Iran. So let's put that source to the side and say, what do we know? What do we not know in terms of where we are? Look, we've got two contradictory processes going on. One is that, yes, the Trump camp have assembled this fleet of more than 12 warships. They've got scores of fighter jets. They've got tens of thousands of American troops in the region, although I'm not expecting boots on the ground to go into Iran. But they obviously are doing with Iran what they did with Venezuela, which is to threaten the airstrikes. Now, we know in Venezuela that it ended not with the airstrikes, but with the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan president. And we also know that at that point, the Trump folks didn't go for regime change because the rest of the regime effectively sold out Maduro so they could stay in power. It's not going to be a straightforward process if the Trump folks wanted to go in and attack Iran to try to get regime change. They're not going to be able to snatch the supreme leader. I dislike the Iranian regime. Everybody knows that. But it has not cracked. Not even the Israeli war of last June that hit it for 12 days. The protest, they went up killing thousands, maybe tens of thousands of protesters. The military, the paramilitary forces, and the inner circle around the supreme leader are still relatively intact. Okay? So that military option is not straightforward. But then I told you there's a contradiction here, and that is that the Trump guys are still in discussions with Iran about Tehran's nuclear program. And indeed, the Iranians are saying, I think because they're playing for time, look, we've made progress in talks about talks, and there's going to be another set of talks this Thursday. I believe this one's going to be in the Gulf. And so it's like, okay, obviously if the Trump folks launched airstrikes, it's going to completely sidetrack the talks on the nuclear program. Iran is not going to talk if they're being attacked. Now, Israel did exactly this last June. There were 5 sets of U.S.-Iran talks on the nuclear programs, and then Netanyahu got twitchy that the talks might go somewhere, and Israel obliterated the senior level of the Iranian military command. They killed more than 20 military leaders. They tried to assassinate political leaders, and they hit a few of them, but it didn't break the regime. All right? So where does this go I think the easiest read on this, Maddie, is that the Trump camp have got that fleet off the coast like a sword of Damocles. It's like, look, you give us what we want or we'll hit you. And indeed, I always take what they say with a grain of salt. But let's go to Donald Trump, who over the weekend effectively said, look, if Iran doesn't get into the talks and give us this, I might hit them within the next 10 days, right? And then real estate developer Steve Witkoff, who seems to be everywhere right now, he gives an interview, and we may talk more in detail later about this, where he says, I don't understand why they haven't surrendered. Why haven't they capitulated and given us everything we wanted? Which is a pretty dumb comment, but it tips off what he thinks and what some of the Trump folks think, which is if we put enough warships off the coast with enough warplanes, then they'll give up their civilian nuclear program and we can declare a big victory. And so that's where we are.
Well, I want to interrupt you, Scott, because I just want to read out that quote because that is my next question, and I think it's important that we follow the rule of order here. You mentioned that the US and Iran, they're still actually, yes, they're having these third round of nuclear talks on Thursday, but yes, Steve Witkoff, he was interviewed by Lara Trump over the weekend. He was confused as to why Iran hasn't bowed down to Trump's demands yet. So the quote is, I don't want to use the word frustrated because he understands he has plenty of alternatives, but he's curious as to why they haven't. I don't want to use the word capitulated, but why haven't they capitulated? Why under this pressure with the amount of sea power and naval power over there? Why wouldn't they come to us and said, we profess we don't want a weapon, so here's what we're prepared to do. And yet it's sort of hard to get them to that place.
Oh, God. I'm sorry. This is when the analyst masks drop and you go, oh my God, either this is the most cynical statement I've ever heard, right? Witkoff saying, I don't understand why they haven't capitulated. Look, I'm going to keep the pressure on them. Or it is the dumbest statement I have ever heard. Not just from a diplomat, which he is not just from someone who knows geopolitics, which he is not, but even from a real estate developer. Can you imagine real estate developer Steve Witkoff going, I want you to give me your land for $100. And if you're not going to give me your land for $100, I'm going to bring bulldozers in and I'm going to tear it all down. And you go, no, Mr. Steve Witkoff, I'm not going to give you my land for $100 because it's worth $100,000. And he goes, I don't understand why you haven't capitulated. Come on. Anybody who knows the basics about the Islamic Republic knows that this regime not only has faced down these threats since 1979 when it took power, it actually benefits from these types of threats. But if you go in and threaten the regime like this, you do this or else, they turn around to the public, a lot of whom don't like them, and a lot of whom would like them out of power or at least want reforms, and they go, the Americans are threatening you. They're threatening you. They're threatening your country. They're threatening your family. They're threatening your nation. You have to support us. They faced this in terms of Israel for decades because those two countries don't get along. They have faced those threats from Gulf states in the past, and they have faced them from the United States. Indeed, after 2003, when the Bush folks went sailing into Iraq, there were Bush advisors who said, we're going to take a right turn and go to Iran and force them to give up their nuclear program. And the Iranians went, okay, let's see you try it. And it never happened. So I just have to put it down to the absolute ludicrous feature of this guy and Donald Trump's son-in-law not only handling arrangements which could, for their profits or whatever, but arrangements that could, if they go wrong, could cause regional conflict all the way across the Middle East. And let me just add one other point, Maddie, how utterly foolish this got last week. Did you notice that on the same day that they were talking to the Iranians in Geneva, they had another set of Ukraine-Russia talks in Geneva? So these guys, real estate developer Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, are handling two sets of talks which are at a critical point and going, shuttling back and forth between the hotels, right? Iran, wait, oh no, it's Ukraine, no, Russia, no. And it's like even the most skilled diplomats would find it difficult to handle two sets of talks on the same day. For these guys getting on here, like if Laurel and Hardy were reincarnated as members of the Trump administration, I think I know who they would be in real life.
Witkoff, he spoke about Iran's uranium enrichment levels, and here's what he said. He said it's up to 60%. They're probably a week away from having industrial grade bomb making material, and that's really dangerous. We can't have that. So I want to get your thoughts on the fact that when it comes to Operation Midnight Hammer, which took place in June last year, Trump and the White House said Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated. So, I mean, what's true? Was it obliterated, or was this just a delay and a damage to Iran's capabilities?
It means they don't have consistent talking points. And I'm going to have to just untangle this to say, well, what did Witkoff say, right? First of all, Maddie, it's really important for viewers out there to know that Iran does not have yet a nuclear weapons program. Okay? Iran has a civilian nuclear program. They've had that for decades. Indeed, Western countries helped the Shah develop that in the 1970s. They have a program which has the potential to be a military weapons program. Let me say this first because it's a really key point as to how the Trump folks got us here. The 2015 nuclear agreement pulled back Iran's nuclear program to 3.67% uranium for civilian needs, right? Iran stopped making 20% uranium, not 60, 20% uranium. Iran returned to 20% enrichment after the Trump folks withdrew from the 2015 agreement and imposed comprehensive sanctions. And then, when the Trump folks kept threatening Iran, Iran said, okay, we're going to go to 60%, right? So what the Iranians are signaling is, look, you keep threatening us, you keep pushing us, we may go with nuclear weapons capability. But they still have not done that. And in fact, I don't think they will, because I think the day that they go to what is 90% uranium capability, the Israelis and the U.S. are going to come in and they're going to make sure they level everything with that nuclear program. What happened last June? The Iranians have got several nuclear facilities. The two most prominent are Natanz and then one which is in the side of a mountain called Fordo. The Israelis hit Natanz, but they couldn't get to the underground one in Fordo. You have to have bunker buster bombs. Who's the only country with bunker buster bombs that could hit the Iranians? The U.S. And that's why the U.S. carried out those strikes. What we know, and it took us a while to establish it because the Iranians were being careful in terms of how much they would say about this, is they damaged the facilities, but they also damaged the entrance to the facilities. They effectively buried the facilities, right? So you've got to go in and not only try to repair the facilities, you've got to get all that rubble out of the way so you can get access to them again. You're probably talking at least months of work. So I think for the general person out there, the Trump and Israel effectively buried Iran's nuclear enrichment program, 20% and 60%, but they didn't completely obliterate it because what you do is you unbury it and you try to repair. And that's what Iran is probably doing. So in a sense, Witkoff, because even a blind squirrel can find an acorn once in a while, probably gets to the point that, yeah, Iran is trying to repair the nuclear program, but they're not a week away from a bomb, okay? Even if they get their 60% uranium back up to speed in enrichment, it's going to take them months, not weeks, it's going to take them months to get to 90%. And then if you make 90% enriched uranium, it's only like for 1, 2, 3 bombs to start off with. Let's ask everybody out there, how many bombs does Israel already have, right? How many do they already have and ready to go if we were talking nuclear? And the answer is more than 150. And that's a conservative estimate.
So in the same interview with Lara Trump, and just moving on to another war, Scott, Steve Witkoff, he has been criticized for what he said about the Russia-Ukraine war and why there's been no resolution through these trilateral peace talks. So he said it really is a silly war and they're fighting over this territory. Everyone throws the word dignity around, but what does dignity get you if you have that amount of killing? I mean, This is a very tone deaf interpretation of a war where one country is the invader and one is the victim, wanting to protect its land, wanting to secure safety for the future of the country so that there is not a third invasion. I mean, what was your take on this? Because quite a few comments from, military analysts, Ukrainian analysts, Ukrainian pundits who are really vocal on social media that kind of walk their viewers like where we're at on the war were understandably really upset that the man who is brokering the end of this war, Trump's delegate, is saying that it is a silly war and kind of putting the onus on the both of the countries.
You think I've been tough on that whining, pouting real estate developer? Just wait. Let's go ask Ukrainians how silly it is to want to have their country. Let's go ask Ukrainians how silly it is to want to have their kids grow up in a place where they're not getting attacked every day on the ground and in the air. Let's ask them how silly it is to refuse to surrender to an invader. How many times has Steve Witkoff, Steve, how many times have you gone to Ukraine during this 4-year full-scale invasion? 0. Now, Steve, repeat for me what you told Laura on how many times you saw Vladimir Putin in the past, 8 times. So you're telling Ukrainians that this is very silly that they're fighting, and you haven't even visited the country, but the Russians knew they could manipulate you. So they got Trump to push aside Keith Kellogg, who was supposed to be the envoy, and they got you in place so they could bring you to St. Petersburg and Moscow, talk to you about all the great economic projects they could have with you, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, if you let the Kremlin get what it wants. So you tell me how silly this is. And you haven't even quoted the full extent of what he said, Maddie, because guess what he says about those 8 meetings with Trump? He's been very, very candid and honest with me. He's been my friend. Hey, Steve, how would you know if Vladimir Putin is being honest with you, buddy? Did you look into his soul like George W. Bush did more than 20 years ago? How would you know? How would you know if he was being honest with you when you went to the Kremlin and you were the only American in the room? You didn't even bring an interpreter with you. The Russians gave you one of their staff to interpret for you. How do you know they were being honest with you at that point? Do you want to answer that one for you? Look, you want to sit there and complain that you're the victim because people don't reach agreements for you, Steve Witkoff, and your boss, Donald Trump? Okay, you do that. But don't you dare, and I know I'm dropping the honest pose now, don't you dare call people who are fighting for their lives and resisting an invasion, don't you dare call them silly. And if you're going to call them silly, you have the decency to go say it to their faces, you jumped up half-wit.
Oh, I didn't expect that level of passion, Scott, but I can't not expect that from you when it comes to comments like that from Steve Witkoff. Now, over to an awkward geopolitical situation over the weekend. So Trump out of the blue wrote on Truth Social, "We're going to send a great hospital boat to Greenland to take care of many people who are sick and not being taken care of. It's on the way." So he wrote that, we think, after there were reports that there was a medical evacuation of a US submarine crew member near Greenland. Now, Greenland's PM basically said thanks, but no thanks. He goes, President Trump's idea of sending an American hospital ship here to Greenland has been noted, but we have a public healthcare system which treatment is free for citizens. It is a deliberate choice, but talk to us instead of just making more or less random outbursts on social media. I mean, this Greenland stuff is just like, we really thought it had simmered down for a bit. He's clearly not giving up on his ambitions to annex Greenland. But Scott, what did you make of this?
He's a big old man baby. All right, it's your turn now, Donald. I've dealt with Steve, right? I'm going to preface this, Maddie, by talking about UFOs. Scott, why would you do that? few days ago, Barack Obama gave an interview, right? And he said, "Yeah, I believe in alien life. I don't believe I'll ever encounter it in my lifetime, but I believe in alien life." Donald Trump's ego was so piqued by his enemy, Barack Obama, saying that, he immediately said, "We're going to launch a government program to establish whether or not there are UFOs and little green men out there." And it's like, hey, Donald, I hate to break this to you, but the U.S. has had a search for extraterrestrial life for decades, right? But there you go. So here we go with Greenland. And you're absolutely right. The Danes actually helped out, the American military. They got a serious medical emergency and they helped this guy out. And what that should have been from Donald Trump is, "Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. We believe in cooperation with our NATO allies." But instead, he thought, "Oh no, I look really terrible here because it's the Danes that have done this. I'm going to send a hospital ship across." And of course, I just can't top what the Danes came back and said, so I'll leave it at that. But I'll add this. U.S. officials have then said to the media, kind of on the quiet, they said, we don't have a hospital ship to go send out there. I mean, we don't know what he's talking about. But for the Danes to then top it and troll him about the domestic situation over healthcare, which actually, Maddie, is quite serious, because when the Danes did that, of course, what they're doing is they're putting a message back to people in Greenland, which is, by the way, and look, the Danes have treated Greenland terrible in the past. And the Danes are very much like, okay, we have done this in the past, but they're reaching out to people in Greenland and saying, "Look, you've got a good healthcare system with us. You've got a good healthcare system with us. You choose to be America's 51st state. Think about your healthcare then." So it was a masterstroke on that part, on top of a bit of Trump idiocy.
So, well, on that note, on the Greenland note, on the Iran note, on kind of everything that we've been speaking about, especially the last few weeks when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, when it comes to the situation with ICE in Minnesota, when it comes to this annexation of Greenland, when it comes to wanting to wage a war with Iran. Reuters are reporting that all of that, the combination that White House advisors and campaign officials are urging Trump to focus on the economy and get back to basics, especially with the midterm elections looming. So Rob Godfrey, a Republican strategist, this is what he told Reuters. He said, "The president has to keep in mind that the political base that propelled him to the Republican nomination 3 consecutive times, and that continues to stick by him, is skeptical of foreign engagement and foreign entanglements, because ending the era of forever wars was an explicit campaign promise." So, I mean, Scott, this coupled with the fact that Joe Rogan, who of course endorsed Trump for the 2024 election, he said this on his show about the political climate right now. He said, "It's overwhelming me. Sometimes at night time, I can't wind down. There's too much news. It's too much effing madness. We're about to go to war with Iran. How far does this go? What's happening?" I wonder, is this the moment that Trump, if Trump sends the US to war, but is this also the moment that he's lost his voters, or has the moment already passed after such a tumultuous year where the focus has really shifted away from what his voter base has wanted, which is a strong economy? They've wanted jobs, manufacturing in America. Of course, the list goes on, and it's not just about the economy, but this is what he prides himself on. If you read any poll, before even a few months ago, economy is always at the top. It doesn't matter what president is in power. It's always at the top. And the Trump administration has been involved in various distractions. I'm not going to put Russia, Ukraine in that because it's so important to keep on that. But yes, what do you think about this? I mean, is this the moment he's lost his voter base?
And I think, let's go step by step on this, Maddie. And I do think that it may mean that you don't have a Trump war with Iran. You might have Trump demonstration strikes on a couple of military nuclear facilities. But you noted earlier that one of the voices against this is J.D. Vance. And I think J.D. knows you may be getting into a world of trouble if you pick a war with Iran. But J.D. also knows that it's going to jeopardize his chances in 28 running for president, because I think it would alienate a lot of Trumpists, precisely because the message was, we're not getting involved in foreign wars. And even though they've gone around and they've threatened Venezuela, they've kidnapped Maduro, they've threatened Greenland and so on, they haven't had, as it were, a protracted American military involvement, on the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan, like that. So, I think it may limit them on Iran. But then beyond that, I think then we run back into the problem of the man baby. Look, let's just keep it on the focus of the economy right now. The problem here is if I don't know any of the viewers out there, if you got a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and they're throwing a big old tantrum, and you go in there and you say, look, I'd like you to focus now, right? I'd like you to focus on calming down and just focusing on keeping some peace in this household, right? And let's just talk about this. Let's just talk this through. You know how many times that works with a screaming 3, 4, 5-year-old? I've been there, right? And that's what Donald Trump is doing. And so let me juxtapose what you just said, which is he should get his focus on the economy. He should stop terrorizing cities and towns with ICE, right? He should stop going off the rails about his political enemies. But then on the issue of the economy, what do you do when the Supreme Court has just struck down your tariffs? And we'll talk in detail what that means, but I just want to highlight what immediately happened, which is the Trump play at that point should be, all right, let's rethink what we're going to do in a very sound, realistic basis. We would like to maintain tariffs. How are we going to do it? But you go back to that press conference he did last week, just after the Supreme Court decision. I swear to God, I mean, he was, even by Trump standards, that tantrum was off the scale. He says, right, the Supreme Court, at least the 6 justices that voted in the majority, 2 of whom were appointed by him. He says they are fools, lapdogs. He says they are unpatriotic and disloyal to the Constitution. He says they're influenced by foreign powers. Anybody else says that in the United States, and the media would have them done. Their career would be over. Because it's Trump, he skates on it immediately. But what he's done is, instead of dealing with the economic issue, he's turned it into his ego, right? So what the Trump folks have to do over the weekend is they have to get it back onto the grounds of, oh, everything's going to be okay. We're going to keep these economic plans in place. Now, I'm happy to discuss the tariffs in detail in a minute to say whether or not getting in place. My point here is they can't get him to focus. The question is going to be, can they push him to the side on the key issues where they can establish what they want to do and prevent him from unsettling it? And that's why J.D. Vance is becoming more important, because Vance knows this. And I'm not going to go all the way to the conspiracy theory yet that Vance will push him out by January of 27, but Vance knows this. Vance knows he's got someone who may not be useful for him now, who may be disruptive. So do other advisors. And I'd be interested to know if Stephen Miller is one of them. If Miller thinks that Trump's gone.
Before we get into tariffs and what happened on Friday, I just want to ask you this one question. If Trump doesn't realign his priorities and his motives back on to the economy and to strengthening the economy for everyday Americans, do you think he will lose key voters ahead of the midterms and it will sufficiently impact the results?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, unless they completely manipulate and what we call, gerrymander the elections by redoing the districts, they're going to lose the House of Representatives, and at the very least, their majority in the Senate is going to be reduced. An outside chance they lose the Senate. And again, I don't like making predictions, Maddie, but if you put the latest facts in here, it was interesting that on the day that the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, the story that was going to dominate the headlines had come out that morning, that the economists were thinking, all right, maybe we get 3% growth in the American economy for the last quarter, the last 3 months of 2025. It came in at only 1.4%. Now, that's well below the growth rate during the Biden years, right? It's well below what the Trump people were saying what was going to happen. Now, of course, they immediately blamed it on the government shutdown. You knew they were going to do that. But in fact, the underlying indicators is that growth is slowing and that inflation is going up. Core inflation is still around 2.9%. That's why Trump gets upset with the Federal Reserve so often. Now, the thing is, even more than Americans seeing those statistics, they see it in day-to-day lives. And I was just in the States a few weeks ago, and it is notable that Trump has not slowed the increase in food prices. Gas prices have come down a bit because the global oil price is down, but grocery prices have not come down. And people are noticing that. And I'll add one other thing, by the way, on top of this. Again, something that ordinary people might not notice, but it's going to factor in. The tariffs did not help the American trade deficit in goods last year. The U.S. deficit in goods, the trade deficit went up by 2%. So even the tariffs are not working on the terms that Trump has set out. So yeah, it's going to have an effect.
Wow, that is interesting about the trade deficit. But just to wrap up our interview, Scott, I want to get your thoughts on what happened on Friday. So just for our audience's understanding, the Supreme Court, yes, they struck down a load of Trump's tariffs in a 6-3 ruling that basically said it was illegal for him to invoke this national emergency powers to do so, and that this tariffs are basically a decision that all of Congress needs to vote on. They need to debate on this. So Trump responded to the news by announcing that he will raise global tariffs to 15% effectively immediately. But I wonder, Scott, is this temporary? And I think I need you to run me through in layman's terms how the Supreme Court's decision affects the way Trump can use tariffs or use them as threats, and even whether companies, whether manufacturers or even consumers will be paid back.
Yeah, let me get to a fundamental in terms of the problem with the Trump tariffs as they have been implemented, and then how this is compounded by the Supreme Court decision in response. The problem here is that you remember Trump's magic chart last April that made absolutely no sense. But what he was effectively saying is we're going to slap a different tariff on every single country, right? So you're talking about like dozens, scores of tariffs. That meant as you get into last week, so the UK's got a 10% tariff on goods. The EU's got a 15% tariff on goods. Some countries have got 20, 25%. India had 50%. Then Trump got scared the Indians are doing trade deals with the EU and with the UK. And so all of a sudden he says, okay, now it's 18%. So there's numbers all over the place. On top of that, there's different numbers in terms of the tariffs on cars, the tariffs on steel, the tariffs on aluminum. You see where I'm going? In other words, it's like this patchwork of tariffs. And just as everyone's getting used to that, the Supreme Court says those tariffs that are based on a specific provision, which is a 1970s Act, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, those you can't use. So those are off the chart, right? So now the Trump folks have got some tariffs that remain in place on national security grounds. I'll explain that in a minute. But a lot of them are gone. And the immediate effect that Trump comes in as he says, 10%. Everybody gets 10%. And then he says, over the weekend, he goes, no, I'm 15. I'm going to make it 15 now. Now, if you're a business or a manufacturer, if you're going to be tariffed, if you're a farmer, and you're going to be, you want certainty. You want to know, because you can't plan and change your plans every week. Businesses plan 6 months, a year, 5 years down the line. And Trump's changing the numbers every single day now. So exactly where are we in terms of what the Trump administration could do? But why doesn't it clarify the situation? The Trump folks can put on a 15% tariff under Section 122, and I just leave that number out there, 15%, but they can only do it for 5 months, 150 days. Then they have to go to Congress because the Supreme Court decision reaffirmed it is Congress that has the power to implement tariffs, not the president. So if they're going to put on these tariffs at 15%, it can only be on a temporary basis. Follow me so far? Right? 15%. Now, how do they get additional tariffs in place? Say that they want to put tariffs on cars, they want to put tariffs on steel and so on. There's two other things they can do. There is what's called Section 232. Now those tariffs are on national security grounds. And they've been used on the past to say, for example, we need steel for national security. Tariffs, right? We need to have an automotive sector, right? Tariffs. They could be used for pharmaceuticals, or at least the Trump folks have threatened them for pharmaceuticals. But the thing about the 232 tariffs is you have to go through and you have to get a formal finding that there is a threat to national security. You cannot implement them immediately. And that process to get the finding normally takes months, right? So they can only talk about potential tariffs under that. The third act they have is 301, Section 301. That's on the grounds of unfair trade practices. They could again say there's unfair trading again over steel, over other areas of manufacturing, over agriculture. But again, you have to get a formal finding that the country you're trying to tariff has been unfair. And you have to do it for every single country that you're going to sanction. That again takes months. So in other words, they still haven't solved that patchwork of tariffs. And if anything, they've made it worse. So I'll just tell you two effects that are happening right now. And then we can talk more next time if we get any clarity on this. The first here is a lot of people are saying, look, can people get money back for the tariffs that have been imposed but then have been swept away by the Supreme Court? Consumers can't get the money back, right? Although consumers bear the brunt of the tariffs, you just you can't have class action suits for millions of people to try to get the money back. Individual businesses could try to sue and get it back, but that's a very cumbersome process. So what has happened is that certain U.S. governors have said, we're going to bring lawsuits to get refunds on the tariffs. So states are going to sue the federal government, and then they'll give money to their constituents, right? We'll see how that plays out. Here's the immediate complication if you're in the UK. The UK had a trade deal with the U.S. a trade framework from last summer for the 10% tariff, right? Plus there's certain specialist tariffs on cars and on steel. Is the UK paying 10% now? Or is it paying 15%? Is the framework still in place or not? The EU had a framework with the US for 15%, but that framework hasn't been ratified by the EU Parliament. So is that still in place, or has it been suspended?
Because I think the European Commission just came out and said basically a deal's a deal. We're not.
Yeah, even though it hadn't been ratified. Yeah, I think that's the easiest one because because it's clarity. They know they've got 15 on the table, right? So if it's 15, they know exactly what they've got. The UK right now thought it had a trade advantage over Europe with the Americans. Remember the Brexit benefit? And they don't know if that's disappeared now, if that's off the table. If you look at stock markets today around the world, they're going to be dipping because they went up on Friday because they thought, great, the Supreme Court finally clarified this for us. And then they immediately started to drop Friday afternoon, and they'll drop again today because we simply don't know. So it's what you and I said last year. It's tariff chaos, and it's unpredictability, it's uncertainty. And to take it back to your broader question, if you've got unpredictability, uncertainty, how does Trump go to the polls in November and portray himself as being a safe pair of hands with the economy?
Exactly, because at the end of the day, no one's voting. The majority of Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They don't vote on what's happening around the world. They vote on how much money they have in their pockets. But we've got to wrap there. Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you, Maddie. Stay safe, stay sane.